I'm Liora Fen, 26 years old. Until 3 months ago, I believed that when you get engaged, your family rallies around you with excitement and support. Then my sister Delaney announced her engagement 2 months before my wedding, and everything changed. Suddenly, I became invisible in my own life story. My mother's words still echo in my mind. Delaney needs more help planning than you do, sweetie. You've always been so independent. What she didn't know was that I had been quietly handling every wedding detail alone for 6 months, from cake tastings to venue negotiations, while she assumed I had everything under control. Before I tell you how everything unraveled, let me share something that makes this story even more unbelievable. When I finally stood at my own altar, the person who walked me down the aisle wasn't who anyone expected. But here's what I want to know. Have you ever wondered what happens when being the easy child costs you everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning I got engaged, I woke up believing my life was finally beginning. Theo had proposed on a quiet Sunday in October, down by the James River where we'd had our first real conversation 3 years earlier. He'd gotten down on one knee right there on the rocky shore, his dark hair catching the autumn light, and asked me to marry him with a voice so steady and sure that I felt my entire world shift into focus. "Liora," he'd said, holding my hands in his callous engineer's grip, "I want to build a life with you that feels like home every single day." I said yes, before he'd even finished the question, and we'd stood there laughing and crying and kissing, while the river rushed past us like it was celebrating too. When we got back to my apartment that afternoon, I immediately called my mother. "Mom, I have news," I'd said, practically bouncing on my toes in my tiny kitchen. "Oh, honey, what is it?" Marilyn Fenn's voice had that distracted quality it always carried, like she was doing 3 other things while talking to me. Theo proposed. We're engaged. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to make my stomach drop. "Oh, Liora, that's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so happy for you both. When are you thinking of having the wedding?" "We were hoping for next September. I know it's only 11 months away, but September? Next year? Oh, honey, that's going to be tight for planning. Are you sure you want to rush into things? You know how these big events can spiral out of control." I'd sat down heavily on my kitchen stool, the euphoria from the proposal beginning to deflate like a punctured balloon. "It's not rushing, Mom. We've been together for 3 years. And 11 months is plenty of time if we start now." Of course. You're right. I'm just thinking about all the vendors and venues ... Well, we'll figure it out. Your father will be so excited. Have you told Delaney yet?" "You're the first person I called." "That's sweet, honey. Listen, I'm actually in the middle of helping your sister with her graduate school applications. But why don't we talk more about this tomorrow? We can start making some lists." The call had ended with promises to discuss details later, but even then I'd felt a familiar ache settle in my chest. It was the same feeling I'd carried through childhood, the sense that my milestones always seemed to arrive at inconvenient times, requiring patience and understanding that other people's celebrations never seemed to need. But I pushed the feeling aside. This was my engagement, my wedding, my time to be the center of attention for once. I'd spent that evening with Theo talking about our future and dreaming about the kind of celebration we wanted. Simple but beautiful, we decided. Meaningful rather than flashy. Something that felt like a stop the next morning, I'd started a wedding planning binder. It was a thick navy blue 3-ring binder that I'd bought from the office supply store, complete with dividers and plastic sleeves. I'd labeled each section carefully in my neat designer's handwriting. Venue, Catering, flowers, photography, music, dress, invitations. I'd even created a timeline spreadsheet, color-coded and cross-referenced with vendor ability and seasonal pricing. Got my best friend. Elle had laughed when they'd seen it 2 weeks later. Liora, this looks like you're planning a military operation. Not a wedding. El Ramesh had been my closest friend since our sophomore year of college, when we bonded over late nights in the graphic design lab and a shared appreciation for obscure indie films. They were one of those people who seemed to contain multitudes. Florists by day who spent their evenings writing poetry and playing bass in a punk band called Existential Crisis Management. If anyone was going to understand the neurotic precision of my wedding binder, it would be Elle. I just want everything to be perfect, I'd said, running my finger along the divider tabs. And if I'm organized enough, maybe it will be. Or maybe, Elle had said, settling cross-legged on my couch with their usual directness, you're trying to control the one thing in your life that you actually get to have ownership over. They weren't wrong. In a family where my mother's attention had always seemed to flow toward whoever needed it most, which was rarely me, this wedding felt like my chance to be seen, to matter, to have something that was undeniably, unquestionably mine. I'd spent those first few weeks of engagement in a state of cautious optimism, reaching out to vendors and scheduling appointments. My mother had come with me to exactly 2 venue tours, before begging off due to work commitments. She was a real estate agent who specialized in historic properties, and she always seemed to be in the middle of some crucial negotiation or client crisis. You have such good taste, sweetheart, she'd said after we toured the second venue, a restored Victorian mansion with gorgeous gardens. I trust you to handle the details. Just keep me posted on the big decisions. So I had. I kept meticulous. Notes from every vendor meeting, created comparison charts for catering options, and even made a Pinterest board that I'd shared with her titled Liora and Theo, September Dreams. She'd liked exactly 3 pins and never commented. The loneliness of wedding planning had crept up on me slowly. At first, I told myself that independence was empowering. I was a grown woman perfectly capable of organizing my own celebration. I didn't need my mother hovering over every decision or turning my wedding into her vision instead of mine. But then I'd started noticing other brides in vendor offices, laughing with their mothers over flower samples or debating invitation fonts with entire family committees. I'd watch them through the corners of my eyes, feeling like an observer studying some foreign species of happiness that I couldn't quite access. The breaking point had come during a dress appointment in November. I'd made an appointment at a boutique that specialized in what they called modern vintage gowns, dresses with classic silhouettes but contemporary details. I'd invited my mother weeks in advance, even sending her a calendar reminder. She'd called that morning to cancel. Honey, I'm so sorry, but I have a showing for the Peterson house. And you know how long we've been trying to close that deal. Can we reschedule? I'd stood in my bathroom, holding the phone and watching my reflection in the mirror. My face had looked pale and pinched. The excitement I'd been carrying all week suddenly drained away. The appointment is at 2, Mom. Don't most showings happen on weekends? Well, yes, but this client can only do weekday afternoons. And you know how competitive the market is right now. You understand, don't you? We can look at dresses anytime. Except we couldn't, apparently, because every time I tried to reschedule, something else had come up. A work emergency, a client dinner, a migraine, a conflicting appointment she'd forgotten to mention. I'd gone to that dress appointment alone, and I'd found the perfect gown on the first try. It was ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves and a chapel train that made me feel like I was floating. When I'd stepped out of the dressing room, the saleswoman had gasped. Oh, honey, that's the one. You look absolutely radiant. I'd stood in front of a three-way mirror, turning slowly to see every angle, and I felt beautiful and heartbroken at the same time. This was supposed to be one of those magical mother-daughter moments, the kind I'd been dreaming about since. I was little. Instead, I was sharing it with a stranger who was paid to be enthusiastic about my choices. I'd bought the dress that day, paying for it with money I'd been saving from my freelance graphic design work. When I called my mother to tell her, she'd been distracted again. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I can't wait to see pictures. Listen, I'm walking into a client meeting, but we'll celebrate properly this weekend, okay?" But that weekend had come and gone without celebration. And the weekend after that, and the one after that by December, I planned roughly 60% of my wedding entirely alone. I'd booked the venue, chosen the caterer, selected the photographer, and even put deposits down on flowers. My binder had grown thick with contracts and receipts and vendor contact information, all organized with the kind of obsessive precision that came from having no one to share the decisions with. Theo had been supportive in his quiet, steady way. He'd come with me to tastings when his work schedule allowed, offering opinions on cake flavors and nodding approvingly at my venue choice. But wedding planning wasn't really his world, and he trusted me to create something beautiful for both of us. "You're amazing at this," he'd said one evening, finding me spread out on our living room floor with vendor brochures and fabric samples scattered around me like the materials for some complex art project. I never would have thought of half these details. "Someone has to think of them," I'd replied, not looking up from the seating chart I was sketching. He had sat down beside me, moving carefully to avoid disturbing my organized chaos. "Are you okay? You seem stressed about all this." I'd wanted to tell him about the loneliness, about the way I felt like I was planning this wedding in a vacuum, while everyone else in my life treated it like a distant, abstract event. But Theo came from a family where his mother had been planning his hypothetical wedding since he was 12 years old. He couldn't understand what it felt like to be forgotten. "I'm fine," I'd said instead. "Just want everything to be perfect." He kissed the top of my head and left me to my planning, and I continued arranging and rearranging details with the desperate hope that if I could just make everything beautiful enough, organized enough, perfect enough, maybe someone would finally notice what I was capable of creating. What I didn't know then was that my mother's attention was about to become even more divided. What I didn't know was that in just a few weeks, my wedding would stop being the most important event on our family's calendar. What I didn't know was that my sister was about to get engaged too. The text came on a Tuesday morning in January while I was in the middle of a client meeting. I felt my phone buzz against my leg and ignored it, focusing instead on the logo concepts I was presenting to a local brewery. But it buzzed again, and then again, and finally I glanced down to see 3 messages from my sister. "Holy shit, I'm engaged. James proposed last night at the restaurant. Call me, call me, call me." My stomach dropped so fast, I thought I might be sick. I smiled and nodded at my clients, somehow managing to finish the presentation while my mind reeled with the implications of those 3 messages. Delaney was engaged. My little sister, who'd been dating James for exactly 8 months, was getting married, and I knew with the kind of certainty that comes from 26 years of family dynamics that everything was about to change. I called her during my lunch break, sitting in my car outside a sandwich shop with my hands shaking slightly as I dialed. "Liora!" Delaney's voice was bright and breathless with excitement. "Can you believe it? I'm getting married. We're both getting married. Isn't that crazy?" "Congratulations," I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "Tell me everything." "How? Did he propose?" The story spilled out of her in a rush of details and superlatives. James had taken her to their favorite restaurant, the same place they'd had their first date, and he'd arranged for the staff to bring out a special dessert with the ring hidden underneath a chocolate dome. There had been rose petals and champagne, and a photographer hiding behind a potted plant to capture the moment. It was like something out of a movie, Delaney gushed. I mean, I knew it was coming because we'd been talking about it, but I didn't expect it to be so elaborate. James really went all out. That sounds beautiful, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I was happy for my sister. Delaney had always been the kind of person who attracted grand gestures and elaborate celebrations. She was magnetic in a way that made people want to create magical moments for her. So, when are you thinking of having the wedding? I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. Well, that's the thing, Delaney said, and I could hear the slight hesitation in her voice for the first time. We want to do it soon. Like, really soon. James had offered this amazing job opportunity that would require us to move to Seattle next year, so we're thinking maybe July? That way we can have the wedding here before we relocate. July, 2 months before my September wedding. Oh, I said, because no other words would come. I know it's close to yours, Delaney continued quickly, but I figured 2 months apart would be fine, right? Actually, it might be better this way. We can share vendors and decorations and stuff. It'll be like a wedding season for the whole family. I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against my steering wheel. Have you talked to Mom about this? Not yet. You're the first person I called after James's parents. But you know, Mom, she's going to be over the moon. 2 daughters getting married in the same year. She's probably going to lose her mind with excitement. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I felt petty and small for not being purely happy about my sister's engagement, but I couldn't shake the dread that was settling in my chest like a stone. I'd been the bride-to-be for exactly 3 months. For 3 months, I'd been the daughter. With the exciting news, the one with the wedding to plan, the one with something worth celebrating. And now, suddenly, I was going to be sharing that spotlight with someone who had always been much better at commanding attention than I was. Call from my mother came 2 hours later. Liora, honey, did Delaney call you? Isn't this exciting news? Yes, it's wonderful, I said, trying to match her energy. I'm really happy for them. 2 weddings. My mother continued, and I could hear the delight in her voice. I can hardly believe it. My little girls are all grown up and getting married. This is going to be such a special year for our family. It really is, I agreed. Did Delaney tell you they're thinking about July? July, yes, isn't that perfect? Right in the middle of wedding season, and the weather will be gorgeous. She's so smart to pick a summer date, so much easier for vendors and venues. And then your wedding in September will be lovely too, with all those fall colors. I waited for her to mention the obvious complication that planning 2 weddings, 2 months apart, was going to be an enormous undertaking. I waited for her to acknowledge that this might create some logistical challenges or require careful coordination. But she seemed genuinely oblivious to any potential problems. Have you thought about how we're going to manage planning both weddings at the same time? I asked carefully. Oh, we'll figure it out, my mother said with the kind of breezy confidence that meant she hadn't actually thought about it at all. It'll be fun, like a big project for all of us. And Delaney's going to need extra help since she's starting from scratch and wants to move so quickly. You've got such a head start on everything. You're so organized and capable. I'm sure you'll be fine. There it was. The assumption that I would be fine, that I would continue to handle my wedding planning independently while she focused on helping. Delaney with the more urgent timeline. Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I've been planning my wedding alone for 3 months. I was kind of hoping that maybe now we could start doing some things together. You know, mother-daughter wedding stuff. Of course, sweetheart. We'll definitely do that. It's just that Delaney's timeline is so compressed. And you know how she gets when she's overwhelmed. She's going to need a lot of hand-holding through this process. And what about me? The question slipped out before I could stop it, sounding smaller and more vulnerable than I'd intended. What about you, honey? Do I need hand-holding? Do I get mother-daughter wedding planning time? Or do I just keep doing everything by myself because I'm the responsible one who never makes a fuss? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear my mother's surprise. I almost never pushed back, almost never asked for attention directly. Liora, of course you get mother-daughter time. You don't have to be jealous of your sister. There's plenty of room for both of you to have beautiful weddings. Jealous. The word hit me like a slap, as if wanting my mother's attention for my own wedding was somehow petty and small-minded. I'm not jealous, I said quietly. I'm lonely. But my mother had already moved on, shifting into problem-solving mode. You know what? This could actually work out perfectly. Delaney could use some of your vendors since you've already done all the research. Maybe you could share your planning. Binder with her. It would save us so much time. I felt something crack inside my chest. My planning binder, the one I'd spent months carefully organizing, the one that contained all my research and contacts and carefully negotiated prices, was going to become a resource for my sister's wedding. Sure, I said, because what else? Could I say? I can share my vendor list. You're such a good sister, my mother said warmly. This is going to be wonderful for everyone. After the call ended, I sat in my car and cried. Not the dramatic, cathartic kind of crying that leads to breakthrough moments, but the quiet, defeated kind that comes from recognizing a pattern you're powerless to change. I've been the responsible child my entire life. The one who didn't make waves, who handled things independently, who never required the kind of emotional maintenance that Delaney seemed to need constantly. And the reward for that reliability was being overlooked when I finally had something worth celebrating. That evening, I told Theo about Delaney's engagement over dinner at our kitchen table. He'd been appropriately happy for her, asking all the right questions about James and the proposal story. But I could see him watching my face carefully, reading the tension I was trying to hide. How are you feeling about the timing? He asked gently. It's fine, I said automatically. 2 months apart is plenty of space. And July is a good time for a wedding. That's not what I asked. I looked down at my plate, pushing pasta around with my fork. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. I'm happy for her, I really am. But I also feel like I'm about to disappear completely. What do you mean? I mean that Delaney has always been the star of this family, and now she's going to be the bride. Who needs help while I'm the bride who has everything under control? And I'm going to spend the next 6 months watching my mother plan the wedding I wish someone would help me plan. Theo reached across the table and took my hand. Have you told your mom how you feel? I tried. She said I was being jealous. Are you? The question surprised me with its directness. I don't know. Maybe? Is it jealous to want your mother to care about your wedding? Is it jealous to want to feel special for once instead of just competent? It's human, Theo said simply, and it's not too much to ask for. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about patterns. About how I'd learned early in life that being the easy child meant being the forgotten child. about how I'd spent years making myself small and undemanding, believing that if I just managed everything perfectly, I'd eventually be rewarded with attention and appreciation. But what I was starting to understand was that people don't notice smooth sailing. They notice storms. And Delaney had always been better at creating weather than I was. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick to work when I wasn't actually sick, and I spent the day sitting on my couch with my wedding binder in my lap, trying to figure out how I was going to survive the next 6 months. My phone buzzed with texts throughout the day. 3 from Delaney asking for vendor recommendations. 2 from my mother asking if I could email my planning spreadsheets to her. 1 from my Aunt Nadine, my mother's estranged sister, who I hadn't heard from in over a year. Heard about the engagement. News. Both of you. Funny how history repeats itself. Call me if you need to talk to someone who understands what it's like to be the forgotten daughter. I stared at that text for a long time, remembering fragments of family stories I never paid much attention to before. Something about my mother and Aunt Nadine both getting married in the same year when they were young, and how it had caused some kind of family rift that had never quite healed. I didn't call her back that day, but I saved her number in my phone just in case, because I was starting to realize that I was going to need all the allies I could find. The transformation happened gradually at first, like watching water boil, nothing obvious, until suddenly everything had changed. Within 2 weeks of Delaney's engagement, my carefully planned wedding timeline had become a footnote to hers. It started with small things. My mother began every phone call by asking about Delaney's plans before remembering to check in about mine. Vendor appointments that I'd scheduled weeks in advance were suddenly being compared to what might work better for Delaney's timeline. My September wedding, which had once felt urgent and important, was now the relaxed backup plan, plenty of time to figure out details after we got Delaney sorted. The first major blow came when my mother called to cancel our appointment at the florist I'd been most excited about. Honey, I'm so sorry, but I need to reschedule our flower consultation. Delaney found the most incredible venue, but they only had 1 viewing slot available this week, and I promised I'd go with her. I was standing in my kitchen, holding a coffee mug that suddenly felt too heavy for my hands. Mom, I made this appointment 6 weeks ago. The florist specifically said that spring consultations book up months in advance. I know, and I feel terrible about it. But you know how competitive the wedding market is, and with Delaney's compressed timeline? Could you maybe go without me and just take pictures? We can discuss the options later. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So I went alone, again. I sat in the florist studio surrounded by sample arrangements and color swatches, taking photos with my phone and trying to imagine, sharing the excitement with someone who wasn't being paid to be enthusiastic about my choices. Florist, a woman named Carmen with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes, seemed to sense my mood. First wedding planning appointment flying solo? She asked gently. Something like that, I said, not trusting myself to explain further. For what it's worth, some of my favorite brides have been the ones who knew exactly what they wanted without a committee second-guessing every choice. There's something powerful about a woman who can envision her own celebration. I'd left that appointment with a beautiful proposal for white peonies and greenery, but also with a growing sense that I was becoming an expert at celebrating my life. By myself, the pattern accelerated after Delaney's venue crisis. She found what she described as the perfect place, restored barn on a lavender farm about an hour outside Richmond. It was rustic but elegant, she said, with string lights and exposed beams and fields of purple flowers that would photograph like a fairy tale. The only problem was that they'd had a last-minute cancellation for a July date, but they needed an answer within 48 hours. "Liora, you have to see this place," Delaney had said, calling me at work in a state of barely contained panic. "It's literally perfect, but I need Mom's opinion before I can put down a deposit. Can you come with us to look at it tonight?" I rearranged my entire evening, canceling a client dinner I'd been looking forward to, and driven out to the farm with my mother and sister. And Delaney was right. It was beautiful. The kind of venue that looked like it had been designed specifically for Instagram, with perfect lighting and picturesque backgrounds at every turn. "This is it," my mother had breathed, walking through the space with the kind of reverent excitement I've been hoping she'd show for my venue. "Delaney, this is absolutely magical. You have to book this." I'd watched them move through the space together, pointing out details and discussing possibilities with an energy that made my chest ache. This was what I'd imagined wedding planning would look like: a mother and daughter sharing excitement, dreaming together, creating something beautiful as a team. "What do you think, Liora?" Delaney had asked, and I could see genuine concern in her face. "It's not too similar to your venue, is it?" My venue was a historic mansion with formal gardens, completely different style, completely different aesthetic. But that wasn't really what she was asking. She was asking if I minded that our mother was falling in love with her venue in a way that she'd never quite managed for mine. "It's perfect for you," I'd said honestly. "Really beautiful." And it was. But beautiful was also watching my mother spend the entire drive home talking about Delaney's wedding with the kind of detailed attention she never quite paid to mine. The vendor sharing started the next week. My mother suggested that since I'd done so much research, and since Delaney was starting from scratch with no time to spare, maybe I could share my carefully curated contact list to help speed up our planning process. "It's just practical," my mother had explained. "You've already vetted all these vendors, so we know they're good. And some of them might even give us a discount for booking 2 weddings." I created a spreadsheet with all my vendor contacts, complete with notes about pricing, availability, and my impressions from our meetings. I'd included the photographer who'd made me laugh during our consultation, the caterer who'd been willing to accommodate my dietary restrictions, and the string quartet I'd found after listening to dozens of sample recordings. Within a week, 3 of them had called to tell me they'd been contacted about a July wedding and wanted to confirm the connection. "Your sister mentioned you'd referred. My photographer had said, 'It's so sweet that you're helping her plan her wedding too. Family weddings are always special.'" I'd made appropriate noises about being happy to help, but internally I felt something that might have been possessiveness. These were my vendors, contacts I'd spent months researching and cultivating. And now they were going to remember me as the sister who'd helped with the referrals rather than the bride who'd hired them first. The breaking point came when my caterer called to tell me they'd had to change my menu tasting date. "I'm so sorry for the short notice," he'd said, "but we need to accommodate your sister's tasting since her timeline is so much tighter. Would the following week work for you instead?" My sister had booked my caterer, the one I'd found, researched, and been planning to hire for months. And now her compressed timeline was taking precedence over my carefully scheduled appointments. I'd hung up the phone and sat in my office for 10 minutes, staring at my computer screen and trying to figure out when exactly I'd become a supporting character in my own wedding story. That evening, I called Elle in a state of frustrated confusion. "I think I'm losing my mind," I'd said without preamble when they answered. "Or maybe I'm just a terrible person. I can't tell anymore." "Okay, slow down," Elle had said in their characteristically calm way. "What happened?" I told them about the vendor sharing, the rescheduled appointments, The way every conversation about my wedding now seemed to include planning considerations for Delaney's. I tried to explain the feeling of watching my mother get excited about wedding details for the first time in months, just not for my wedding. So let me get this straight. Elle had said when I finished, "Your family is treating your wedding like a practice run for your sister's wedding?" They're not doing it on purpose. It's just that her timeline is more urgent, and I've always been the one who handles things independently. Liora. Elle's voice had gotten very quiet and very serious. Listen to yourself. You're making excuses for people who are making you feel like shit about your own wedding. But no buts. This is your wedding, your celebration. You're one shot at being the bride. And you're letting them turn you into the wedding planning coordinator for someone else's event. I'd started crying then, the kind of tears that come from relief at having someone finally understand what you've been trying not to feel. "I don't know how to fix it," I'd said. "I don't know how to ask for attention without sounding like a jealous child." You start by recognizing that wanting your mother's support for your wedding isn't childish, it's completely reasonable. And then you decide whether you're going to keep accepting scraps or start demanding the meal you deserve. After we'd hung up, I'd sat with Elle's words for a long time. I'd spent so many years being the easy child, the one who didn't cause problems or require extra attention, that I'd forgotten how to advocate for myself when it mattered. But I was starting to understand that if I didn't learn how to take up space in my own life, I was going to end up invisible at my own wedding. The next morning, I'd made a decision. I was going to stop sharing vendors. I was going to stop rescheduling my appointments to accommodate Delaney's timeline. And I was going to start having some difficult conversations about what I needed from my family during this process. It felt scary and selfish and completely against every instinct I developed over 26 years of family dynamics. But it also felt like the first step toward reclaiming something that had always belonged to me. I'd started by calling my mother. "Mom, we need to talk about the wedding planning," I'd said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about the vendor situation, and I've realized I'm not comfortable sharing all my contacts with Delaney. These are relationships I've built over months of research, and I'd like to keep some of them for my own wedding." The silence on the other end had lasted long enough for me to wonder if we'd been disconnected. "Liora, I'm surprised to hear you say that. I thought you wanted to help your sister." "I do want to help her. But I also want to have my own wedding vendors, my own planning process, my own special details that aren't shared with someone else's celebration. But it's so much more efficient to coordinate ... I don't want efficient, Mom. I want personal. I want my wedding to feel like mine." Another pause. "Are you sure you're not just feeling a little overwhelmed by all the planning? Maybe we should think about simplifying your event so it's more manageable." And there it was, the assumption that if I was having trouble, the solution was to make my celebration smaller rather than to give me more support. "I'm not overwhelmed by the planning," I'd said carefully. "I'm lonely in the planning. There's a difference." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been planning this wedding by myself for 4 months, and I was hoping that at some point it might become something we could do together. But instead, it feels like everyone's energy is going toward helping Delaney while I just keep managing everything independently." "Honey, I'm proud of how capable you are. And Delaney really does need more help." "Why?" The question had come out sharper than I'd intended. Why does she need more help? Because her timeline is compressed? Because she's more dramatic? About her stress? Because she's better at asking for attention? "Liora, that's not fair, isn't it? When's the last time you asked me how I was feeling about my wedding instead of asking me what vendors I could recommend for Delaney's?" The silence that followed had felt heavy with years of unspoken family dynamics. I'd been holding my breath, waiting for my mother to acknowledge what I was trying to tell her, waiting for her to understand that her capable daughter was also her lonely daughter. "I think you're being a little dramatic," she'd said finally. "And I'm disappointed that you're not being more supportive of your sister." During what's obviously a stressful time for her, I'd hung up feeling worse than when I'd started, but also somehow clearer, because now I knew exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy and exactly how much support I could realistically expect, which was to say, none. That afternoon, I pulled out the business card that had been sitting in my wallet for weeks. Aunt Nadine's number, saved from that text she'd sent me after the engagement announcements. It was time to call someone who understood what it felt like to be the forgotten daughter. Aunt Nadine lived in a small cottage about 20 miles outside Richmond, surrounded by wild gardens that looked like they'd been planted by someone who understood that beautiful things don't always need to be controlled. When I pulled into her driveway on a gray Saturday morning in February, I felt like I was entering a different world entirely. I'd called her the week before, finally working up the courage to reach out after my disastrous conversation with my mother. When I told her I wanted to talk about family patterns and weddings, she'd been quiet for a long moment before saying, "Come for coffee next weekend," and bring an appetite for uncomfortable truths. Now, standing on her front porch with a bouquet of grocery store flowers that suddenly seemed inadequate, I was wondering if this had been a mistake. I barely knew my aunt. She'd been the absent figure at family gatherings for most of my life, mentioned occasionally in whispered conversations that stopped when children walked into the room. The woman who opened the door was smaller than I'd remembered, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a messy bun and paint stains on her fingers. She looked like an older, softer version of my mother, but with something in her eyes that my mother had never carried, a kind of hard-won peace. "Liora," she said, and her voice was warm but careful. "You look just like your mother did at your age. Come in." Her house felt like stepping into a painting. Every surface held books or ceramic mugs or half-finished art projects. The walls were covered with photographs and paintings, most of which seemed to feature gardens or landscapes rendered in soft, dreamy colors. "You're an artist," I said, looking around with genuine admiration. "I am a woman who paints," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Coffee?" We settled in her kitchen with oversized mugs and a plate of homemade scones that tasted like butter and contentment. For a few minutes, we made small talk about my work and her latest painting project, but I could feel her watching me carefully, waiting for me to find the courage to say why I'd really come. "I read somewhere that you and my mother got married." "In the same year?" I said finally. Nadine's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. 1987. I was 23. She was 25. Both spring weddings, both disasters in their own ways. "What happened?" She set down her mug and looked at me with the kind of directness that made me understand why she'd been estranged from our family for so long. "What's happening to you right now?" I imagine. The golden child gets the attention, the responsible child gets forgotten, and everyone pretends it's normal and fair. The recognition hit me like a physical blow. She was the golden child too? "Oh, honey, your mother has been the golden child her entire life. Beautiful, charming, dramatic when she needed attention and competent when she didn't. I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who never required extra maintenance." Nadine's smile was rueful. "Sound familiar?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. When we both got engaged, I thought maybe this would be my chance to be special too. I'd been planning my wedding for 8 months, everything carefully organized and budgeted. I was so proud of what I put together on my teacher's salary." She paused, looking out her kitchen window at the wild garden beyond. "Then your mother announced her engagement 3 months before my wedding date. And suddenly my careful planning was boring and her whirlwind romance was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to our family." "What did you do?" "I tried to be the bigger person. I shared vendors, I helped her plan, I pretended that." Watching my mother fuss over her details while treating mine like a checklist didn't hurt. Nadine's voice got quieter. "I let them turn my wedding into the opening act for hers." I felt tears starting behind my eyes. And how did that work out? Terribly. My wedding felt like a practice run for hers. The photographer spent half my reception talking about the different vision he was excited to try for your mother's wedding 2 months later. The florist used my arrangements as a test run for what she was planning to do for Marilyn's. Even my own mother spent my wedding day talking about what she was going to do differently for the next one.
That's horrible.
It was. But what was worse was how I let it happen. How I convinced myself that being supportive and mature meant accepting crumbs from my own family. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers.
Don't make.
My mistake, Liora. I don't know how to not make it. I don't know how to be the kind of person who demands attention. You don't have to demand anything. You just have to stop accepting less than you deserve. She got up and disappeared into another room, returning with a photo album I hadn't noticed before. "I want to show you something." The album was full of wedding photos from 1987, but not the formal portraits I was expecting. These were candid shots, moments between the posed pictures that told a story I never heard before. "This was my wedding day," Nadine said, pointing to a photo of herself in a simple white dress, laughing at something someone had said off camera. She looked radiant and happy, completely present in her own moment. "You look beautiful," I said. And I meant it. I felt beautiful. In spite of everything, on that day, I felt special and loved and worthy of celebration. She turned the page, and this was your mother's wedding. The photos were more elaborate, more formally styled. My mother looked stunning in a dress that probably cost 3 times what Nadine's had. But there was something in her expression that looked almost frantic, like she was performing happiness rather than feeling it. "The difference," Nadine said quietly, "is that I stopped caring about anyone else's approval by the time I walked down the aisle. I'd learned that the only person who could make my day special was me." "How did you learn that?"
The hard way.
About a month before my wedding, I realized that I had 2 choices. I could keep waiting for my family to celebrate me the way I wanted to be celebrated, or I could start celebrating myself. So I started planning the parts of my wedding that mattered to me, regardless of what anyone else thought. She turned to another section of the album, showing photos of her reception. It looked different from the formal celebration I'd been imagining, more intimate, more personal. The centerpieces were clearly homemade. The music seemed to be coming from a simple speaker system rather than a band, and everyone looked genuinely happy rather than performatively festive. I had invited the people who made me feel small. Nadine. Sad? I fired the vendors who treated my wedding like a practice run. I planned a celebration that reflected what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I was supposed to want. And it was the most beautiful day of my life. Even though you were alone in the planning, I wasn't alone. I just stopped expecting support from people who had already shown me they weren't capable of giving it. She pointed to a photo of herself dancing with a group of friends I didn't recognize. I found my people. The ones who wanted to celebrate me for who I was, not who they needed me to be. I studied the photos for a long time, trying to understand what she was telling me. What happened after the weddings? Why did you and my mother stop talking? Nadine's face tightened slightly, because I finally told her how her behavior had affected me. And instead of apologizing or trying to understand, she told me I was jealous and immature and that I needed to grow up and stop making everything about myself. She closed the album gently. Sound familiar? It did. It sounded exactly like the conversation I'd had with my mother the week before. I realized then that our relationship was only sustainable as long as I was willing to be invisible. The moment I asked for anything recognition, support, basic consideration, I became the problem. Nadine's voice was matter-of-fact, but I could hear the old pain underneath. So I stopped trying to be invisible. And you've been estranged ever since? We've been honest ever since. I stopped pretending that a relationship where I had to constantly minimize myself was healthy. She stopped pretending that she wanted a sister instead of an audience. I felt overwhelmed by the weight of what she was telling me. I don't want to lose my family.
Then don't.
But also don't lose yourself trying to keep people who only love you when you're convenient. She reached across the table again. What do you actually want your wedding to be like, Liora? If you could have anything, regardless of what anyone else thinks. The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on managing other people's expectations and needs that I'd almost forgotten what my own desires look like. Small, I said immediately. Intimate, more like a dinner party with the people who actually know and love me than a performance for distant relatives and family friends. What else? Personal. I wanted to feel like Theo and me, not like someone else's vision of what a wedding should be. I paused, thinking, and I want to feel celebrated. Not just competent or organized or helpful. I want to feel like the people there are genuinely excited to witness our marriage. Those things are all completely achievable, Nadine said. But probably not with the guest list your mother has in mind. She was right. The wedding I was describing sounded nothing like the 150-person celebration my family was expecting. But it sounded like something I actually wanted to attend. How do I get from where I am now to what I actually want? You start making decisions based on what serves you instead of what serves everyone else. You stop asking permission to have the celebration you want. And you accept that some people are going to be disappointed when you stop performing the role they've written for you. I left Nadine's house that afternoon with a different photo album one she'd insisted I borrow. It was full of pictures from her life after the wedding, showing her traveling alone, creating art, building a home that reflected her actual tastes rather than what was expected of her. This is what happens when you stop waiting for other people to give you permission to be yourself, she'd said as she walked me to my car. Driving home, I thought about everything she'd told me. About patterns that repeat themselves across generations. About the difference between being alone and being lonely. About the courage it takes to choose yourself when everyone around you benefits from your self-sacrifice. That evening, I sat down with my wedding binder and started making 2 lists. The first was everything I planned so far based on what I thought was expected of me. The second was everything I actually wanted. The differences were startling. The wedding I'd been planning was a performance designed to prove that I could create something beautiful and impressive without help. The wedding I actually wanted was a celebration designed to surround me and Theo with love and support from the people who knew us best. It was time to start planning a different kind of wedding entirely. The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March, completely by accident. I'd stopped by my parents' house to drop off some paperwork my mother needed for her taxes, using the key I'd had since high school to let myself in when no one answered the door. I was leaving the documents on the kitchen counter when I heard my mother's voice coming from her home office down the hall. "I just don't know what to do about Liora," she was saying, and something in her tone made me freeze. I knew I should announce my presence, call out that I was there, gather my things, and leave. But something kept me rooted to the spot, listening to a conversation I was never supposed to hear. "She's being so difficult about the vendor sharing," my mother continued, and I realized she was talking to my father. "And honestly, I'm starting to think she's having some kind of breakdown about the wedding planning. She actually accused me of playing favorites between her and Delaney." My stomach dropped. They were talking about our conversation from the week before, but the version my mother was telling bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. Well, is she wrong? My father's voice was quieter, harder to hear. "Of course she's wrong. I've been supportive of both girls equally. But Liora has always been so independent, so capable of handling things on her own. Delaney needs more guidance. She gets overwhelmed when she doesn't have help. I'm just being a good mother by giving each daughter what she needs. Marilyn, and the vendor thing is just practical. Liora spent all that time researching, so why wouldn't we use that information to help Delaney? It's not like Liora owns these people. They're businesses, they want multiple clients." I pressed my back against the hallway wall, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they'd be able to hear it. "Maybe that's not really the point," my father said gently. "Maybe Liora wants to feel like her wedding is special and unique to her. That's exactly what I mean about her being difficult. Since when does Liora care about being special? She's always been perfectly happy being the responsible one, the one who doesn't need extra attention. This jealousy thing is completely new, and frankly, it's not attractive." The words hit me like physical blows. Not attractive. As if wanting my mother's support for my wedding was some kind of character flaw that made me less lovable. "Have you considered?" my father said, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "That maybe Liora has never asked for attention because she learned early that it wasn't available to her? That maybe she's been the responsible one because that was the only role that got her any recognition at all? Oh, please. That's psychobabble, Robert. Liora got plenty of attention growing up. Just because she wasn't as dramatic as Delaney doesn't mean she was neglected. When's the last time you spent one-on-one time with Liora that wasn't about solving a problem or asking her to help with something?" The silence that followed that question lasted so long I thought they might have left the room. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was defensive. "That's not fair. Liora doesn't like one-on-one time. She's always been more comfortable in groups or handling things independently. I've been respecting her personality. Or maybe," my father said quietly, "you've been taking advantage of it." "Excuse me? Marilyn, I love you, but I've watched you do this with both our daughters their entire lives. Delaney creates drama, so she gets attention and help and emotional support. Liora solves problems quietly, so she gets more problems to solve. And you've convinced yourself that this is giving them what they need instead of what's convenient. For you, I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the hallway floor, tears streaming down my face. My father, my quiet, diplomatic father who never called anyone out on anything, was finally saying what I'd never been able to articulate. "That's a horrible thing to say," my mother replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it wrong? Of course it's wrong. I love both my daughters equally." "I didn't say you didn't love them equally. I said you don't treat them equally, because they don't need equal treatment. They need different things. Do they? Or do you give Delaney what she demands and give Liora what's left over?" The silence stretched again, and I could picture my mother's face, the way it looked when she was forced to confront something she didn't want to acknowledge. "I think you're being unfair," she said finally. "And I think you're encouraging Liora's. worst instincts by suggesting that her jealousy is justified. What if it's not jealousy, Marilyn? What if it's just sadness? That question hung in the air like a physical presence. What if it's just sadness? I felt something crack open in my chest, some defense I'd been holding against my own feelings. I need to go, my mother said abruptly. I'm meeting Delaney to look at dress shops this afternoon. What about Leora's dress shopping? Didn't she find something she wanted to show you? She already bought a dress. Didn't even ask for my opinion, just went ahead and bought it on her. Oh, which is fine, of course. She has excellent taste. Did you ask to see it? Another pause. She didn't offer to show me. Did you ask? Robert, I don't have time for this conversation. Some of us have weddings to plan. I heard her gather her things and head toward the front of the house. I scrambled to my feet and slipped quickly out the back door, my heart pounding as I made my way to my car. I sat in their driveway for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just heard my father understood. After years of watching the family dynamics play out, he finally understood what I'd been trying to explain. But more than that, he'd been watching it happen my entire life, and he'd known it was unfair. The question that kept running through my mind was, if he knew, why hadn't he done anything about it sooner? That evening, I called him. I'd never called my father independently before. Our relationship had always been mediated through my mother. Family dinners where he was present, but not central. Conversations that happened in groups rather than one-on-one. Dad, I said when he answered, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Do you think Mom plays favorites between me and Delaney? The pause was so long I thought we might have been disconnected. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful but clear. I think your mother loves you both deeply, but I think she's never learned how to show love in ways that aren't driven by crisis or drama. And I think that's been harder on you than it has been on your sister. Why haven't you ever said anything? Because I've been conflict avoidant my entire life, and that's been a disservice to both you and Delaney. I told myself that keeping the peace was more important than addressing unfairness, and I was wrong. I started crying then, not from sadness, but from relief. Someone in my family finally saw what I'd been experiencing. Someone finally acknowledged that the dynamic I'd been living with wasn't normal or healthy or fair. What should I do, Dad? About the wedding, about everything. I think you should plan the wedding you actually want, with or without your mother's support. And I think you should stop trying to earn love from people who should be giving it freely. Well, you help me? However you need me to. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start planning my wedding based on what I wanted rather than what was expected of me. I was going to stop sharing resources with Delaney, and I was going to start building the celebration I actually wanted to have, even if it meant disappointing people who had already shown me that my happiness wasn't their priority. The next morning, I called Al and asked them to meet me for coffee. When they arrived at our usual cafe, I was already there with a notebook and a new kind of energy they'd never seen before. I need to tell you something, I said. And then I need your help completely reinventing my wedding. They sat down across from me with their characteristic directness. I'm listening. I told them about the overheard conversation, about my father's unexpected support, about the realization that I'd been planning someone else's version of my wedding instead of my own. So, what do you actually want? Al asked. I want a small wedding with only the people who genuinely want to celebrate us. I want personal details that reflect our actual relationship instead of Pinterest perfect decorations. I want to feel special instead of competent. And I want to stop trying to prove that I can do everything alone. Elle smiled. The kind of smile that meant they were already 3 steps ahead of me in the planning process. How small are we talking? 30 people, maybe 40, just family and close friends. And where? I took a deep breath. I want to ask Aunt Nadine if we can use her garden. Al's smile widened. Now you're talking. The confrontation I'd been dreading came exactly 3 weeks after. I'd started planning my real wedding. I'd spent those weeks in a state of determined focus, working with Elle to create something that felt genuinely mine for the first time in months. We designed new invitations on my computer, simple, elegant cards with hand-lettered text that read, "Liora and Theo invite you to celebrate their marriage," with no mention of parents or formal hosting language. I revised my guest list down to 38 people, keeping only those who I genuinely wanted to witness our marriage. And I booked new vendors, a small local caterer who specialized in family-style dinners, a photographer whose work felt intimate rather than performative, and a folk duo I found playing at a coffee shop who agreed to provide music for the cost of dinner and gas money. Most importantly, I'd had the conversation with Aunt Nadine about using her garden for the ceremony. She'd said yes immediately, with tears in her eyes and an offer to help with any details I needed. For the first time in months, wedding planning felt joyful instead of exhausting. I should have known it couldn't last out. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while I was addressing the new invitations at my kitchen table. Theo was working late, and I'd been enjoying the quiet satisfaction of writing names and addresses in my careful script, anticipating the relief I'd feel when I finally sent out invitations to the wedding I actually wanted.
Liora, we need to
talk. My mother's voice was sharp in a way I'd rarely heard before. I just got off the phone with Carmen from Petals and Pine. She said you called to cancel your flower order. My stomach dropped. I'd forgotten that I'd put my mother's name as an emergency contact on several vendor contracts, back when I'd still been hoping we'd plan the wedding together. I changed my mind about the flowers, I said carefully. I found someone else whose style is a better fit. Without discussing it with me, Liora, we already put down a deposit with Carmen. And more importantly, Delaney was planning to use her. Too now Carmen is confused about which sister wants what arrangements. Of course this was about Delaney. Mom, I never agreed to coordinate my vendor choices with Delaney's wedding. I'm allowed to make my own decisions about my own flowers. What is going on with you? My mother asked, and I could hear genuine bewilderment in her voice. This isn't like you at all. First the vendor list, now you're canceling arrangements. Without telling anyone. Are you trying to sabotage Delaney's planning process? No, I'm trying to plan my own wedding. By creating chaos for everyone else involved? I took a deep breath, looking down at the stack of invitations spread across my table. The courage I'd been building over the past 3 weeks felt fragile suddenly, but it was still there. Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really listen to me. I'm listening. I'm changing my wedding. The venue, the style, the size, everything. I'm having a small ceremony in Aunt Nadine's garden with just close family and friends. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. What do you mean you're changing your wedding? My mother's voice was very quiet. I mean, I'm planning the celebration I actually want instead of the one I thought I was supposed to want. 38 people, family-style dinner, simple and personal. 38 people? Liora, we have over 100 people on the invitation list. What about your father's colleagues? What about the Hendersons and the Pettys? What about Great Aunt Louise? I don't want Great Aunt Louise at my wedding, Mom. I've spoken to her maybe 5 times in my entire life. She's family. So am I. The words came out louder than I'd intended, carrying months of accumulated frustration. I'm family too, and This is my wedding, and I want it to be about the people who actually know and love me.
Liora, you can't just. This is crazy.
You've been planning this wedding for almost a year. Everything is already booked and paid for. I can get most of my deposits back. And the things I can't, I'll consider the cost of learning what I actually want. What about Delaney? You're going to leave her high and dry with all the vendors you recommended? How is that fair? And there it was, the assumption that my decisions about my own wedding should be based on how they affected my sisters. Planning process. Delaney is a grown woman who can research her own vendors, I said. Just like I did for the past year, while everyone assumed I didn't need help. Don't be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic, Mom. I'm being honest. Do you want to know what dramatic looks like? Dramatic is planning an entire wedding by yourself while your mother is too busy helping your sister to notice that you're struggling. Dramatic is crying in vendor offices because you don't have anyone to share the excitement with. Dramatic is finding out that your own family thinks you're difficult and not attractive when you finally ask for support. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. I heard you talking to Dad about how I'm being difficult and jealous and unattractive, about how I should be grateful for neglect because it means I'm independent.
Liora, that's not what I said. It's exactly what you said.
And it's exactly how you've treated me my entire life. The responsible child who doesn't need attention, who can handle everything on her own, who should be grateful to be ignored because it means she's capable.
That's not fair, isn't it?
When's the last time you asked how I'm feeling about my wedding without immediately asking what vendors I can recommend for Delaney? When's the last time you wanted to spend time with me that wasn't about solving a problem or asking for help? The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken dynamics finally being named. I've been a good mother to you, my mother said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. You've been an adequate mother. You've made sure I was fed and clothed and educated and safe. But you've never been excited about who I am as a person. You've never celebrated my achievements the way you celebrate Delaney's. And you've certainly never shown up for me the way you show up for her. I show up differently for both of you because you need different things. No. Mom, you show up for the child who demands attention and you ignore the child who doesn't. And you've convinced yourself that's good parenting instead of taking the easy way out. I could hear crying on the other end of the line, and part of me wanted to take it all back, to apologize and return to the familiar role of the daughter who didn't cause problems. But I thought about Aunt Nadine's photos, about my father's words, about the wedding invitations spread across my table that finally reflected what I actually wanted. I'm having my wedding on September 15th in Aunt Nadine's garden, I said, quietly. You're invited, of course. But I'm not negotiating about the details anymore. This is what I want, and this is what's happening. Liora, please. I love you, Mom, but I'm done waiting for you to love me the way I need to be loved. I'm done making myself small so other people can feel big. And I'm done planning my life around other people's comfort instead of my own happiness. I hung up before she could respond, my hand shaking as I set the phone down. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, looking at the invitations and trying to process what had just happened. I'd never spoken to my mother that way before directly. Angrily, without cushioning my words to spare her feelings, thought it felt terrifying and exhilarating and long overdue. When Theo got home an hour later, he found me still sitting at the table, surrounded by wedding invitations and the remnants of the conversation that had changed everything. How did it go? He asked gently, and I realized I'd told him I was planning to call my mother about the wedding changes. I think I just ended a relationship, I said. Or maybe I just started one. He sat down beside me and pulled me into his arms, and I told him about the conversation, about the accusations and the tears and the moment when I'd finally stopped, protecting my mother from the consequences of her own choices. "Are you okay?" he asked when I finished. "I think so." Scared, but okay. I looked at the invitations again, at the simple, elegant design that reflected our actual aesthetic instead of what was expected. I feel like I just reclaimed my own life. What happens now? Now we send these invitations, and we plan a wedding that makes us happy. And we let other people deal with their feelings about our choices instead of managing those feelings for them. That night, I called Elle to tell them about the conversation. They listened without interruption as I recounted every word, every pause, every moment of courage and terror. "How do you feel?" they asked when I finished. "Like, I just learned how to breathe," I said. "And like, I'm about to find out who in my family actually loves me versus who just loves the idea of me. Are you ready for that?" I thought about it for a long moment, considering the weight of what I'd just set in motion. I'm ready to stop living for people who only accept me when I'm convenient. The next morning, I mailed 38 wedding invitations to the people who had consistently shown up for me throughout my life. Elle, my college friends, Theo's family, my father, Aunt Nadine, and even after a long internal debate, my mother. And Delaney Dot, because despite everything, I still wanted them there. I just wasn't willing to sacrifice my own happiness to guarantee their attendance. 2 days later, the responses started coming in. Every single one said yes, most with notes about how excited they were to celebrate us and how beautiful the intimate. Ceremony sounded all except two. September 15th dawned clear and golden, the kind of autumn morning that feels like a gift from the universe. I woke up in Aunt Nadine's guest room surrounded by the sound of birds and the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. For the first time in months, I felt completely calm. The past 6 months had been a complicated journey of family reconstruction and relationship redefinition. My mother had spent the first 2 weeks after our confrontation trying to convince me to change my mind about the wedding, alternating between guilt trips and angry lectures about family obligation. When that didn't work, she'd moved into a phase of cold politeness, treating me like a distant relative rather than her daughter. Delaney had been caught in the middle, initially angry about the vendor situation, but gradually coming to understand that my choices weren't about sabotaging her wedding, they were about saving my own. Her July celebration had been beautiful and exactly what she'd wanted. Lavish, photogenic, filled with extended family and formal traditions. She'd looked radiant and happy, and I'd been genuinely glad to celebrate her, even as I felt more certain than ever that we wanted completely different things from our weddings. The real surprise had been my father. In the weeks leading up to my wedding, he emerged as an unexpected ally, calling me regularly to check in and offering to help with whatever I needed. He'd walked Delaney down the aisle in July, but when I'd asked him a month later if he'd be willing to walk me down the garden path to Theo, he'd gotten tears in his eyes. "I would be honored," he'd said, "and I'm proud of you for choosing what makes you happy instead of what makes everyone else comfortable." Now, sitting in Nadine's kitchen in my pajamas while she made pancakes and Elle fussed with the flowers they'd arranged the night before, I felt surrounded by the kind of love I'd been craving my entire life. Steady, uncomplicated, focused on celebration rather than performance. "How are you feeling, bride?" Elle asked, looking up from the mason jars they were filling with wildflowers and eucalyptus. "Perfect," I said, and meant it. For the first time in my life, I feel exactly where I'm supposed to be. Nadine set a plate of pancakes in front of me and kissed the top of my head. That's what happens when you stop trying to be who other people need you to be. The morning passed in a blur of gentle preparation. Elle did my hair in loose waves that felt romantic but unfussy. Nadine helped me into my dress, the same ivory gown I'd chosen alone 9 months earlier, but which now felt like exactly the right choice. My makeup was simple and natural, applied by a friend from college who'd driven down from DC to be part of the celebration. 11:30. Guests started arriving. I watched from the upstairs window as people filled Nadine's garden, settling into the mismatched chairs we'd borrowed from the local community center and arranged in a loose semicircle under the oak tree, where Theo and I would exchange vows. These were my people. Elle's partner Sam, who'd driven in from North Carolina with a trunk full of late-season flowers from their own garden. My college roommate Maya, who'd flown in from Seattle with her husband and their baby daughter. Theo's parents and his sister, who'd embraced me from the beginning with the kind of uncomplicated warmth I'd always envied. My father's brother and his wife, who'd driven down from Baltimore and brought his mother, the one grandmother I'd actually been close to growing up. And sitting in the front row, looking slightly out of place but determinedly present, were my parents. My mother had called 2 weeks before the wedding to say that she and my father would be attending. The conversation had been stiff and formal, more like accepting a social obligation than celebrating her daughter's marriage, but she'd shown up. That felt like something, even if it wasn't everything I'd hoped for. At noon exactly, the folk duo started playing a simple acoustic version of The Way You Look Tonight, a song that had been playing in the coffee shop where Theo and I had our first real conversation. I felt my heart speed up with anticipation and joy rather than nervousness. Elle met me at the bottom of the stairs with my bouquet wildflowers and herbs from Nadine's garden, tied with a ribbon that had belonged to my grandmother. "Ready?" they asked. "So ready." My father was waiting by the back door, looking handsome in his navy suit and more emotional than I'd ever seen him. When he saw me, his face crumpled slightly. "You look beautiful, sweetheart. Not just the dress, you look happy." "I am happy, Dad, really, truly happy." He offered me his arm, and we walked together through Nadine's back garden toward the ceremony space. I could see Theo waiting under the oak tree, talking quietly with the officiant, a friend of his from college who'd gotten ordained online specifically to marry us. When he saw me coming down the path, his face lit up with pure joy. This was what I'd been missing in all my previous wedding planning. Not the perfect dress or the ideal flowers or the most impressive venue, but the feeling of being completely seen and celebrated by the people who mattered most. The ceremony itself was everything I'd hoped for. Personal, meaningful, filled with laughter and tears in all the right places. Theo and I had written our own vows, and we'd asked our officiant to keep the formal parts brief and focus on the promises we were making to each other. When Theo said, "Liora, you've taught me that the most beautiful celebrations happen when we have the courage to be ourselves instead of who we think we're supposed to be." I felt tears stream down my face when I said, "Theo, you've shown me what it feels like to be loved for exactly who I am, and I promise to spend our marriage creating that same feeling for you every day." I watched him mouth, "I love you," with his eyes shining. The kiss that sealed our marriage was soft and sweet and completely perfect. When we turned to face our guests as husband and wife, the cheer that went up from our small group was more joyful than any sound I'd ever heard. The reception was exactly what I'd envisioned. A family-style dinner served on long tables under string lights, with conversations that meandered and laughter that felt genuine. Elle's partner had made a playlist of songs that actually reflected our musical taste rather than what was traditional at weddings. People moved between tables, sharing stories and toasting our marriage with champagne and homemade cocktails. The most meaningful moment came during the informal toasts. My father stood up first, raising his glass with hands that shook slightly. "I want to say something about my daughter," he began, looking directly at me. Liora has always been the kind of person who makes everyone around her feel comfortable and supported. But what I've learned this year is that she's also brave enough to ask for the same support in return. This wedding is exactly what she and Theo wanted, and seeing their happiness today reminds me that the best celebrations happen when we honor who people actually are instead of who we think they should be. Aunt Nadine spoke next, talking about the courage it takes to choose authenticity over approval and how proud she was to see me claim my own joy. Theo's sister shared embarrassing stories about his childhood that made everyone laugh. Elle gave a toast about finding your chosen family and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who celebrate your growth instead of resenting it. My mother didn't speak, but she didn't leave early either. She sat at her table and smiled when appropriate and seemed to be trying in her own way to be present for my celebration. It wasn't the relationship I'd always hoped for, but it was honest in a way our previous dynamic had never been. As the evening wound down and guests started to head home, I found myself sitting with Theo under the fairy lights, watching Elle and Sam dance to a song that was probably too slow for the tempo, but perfect for the mood.
Was it everything you wanted?
Theo asked, pulling me closer on the bench we borrowed from Nadine's front porch. It was better, I said. It was actually mine. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the music and the murmur of conversation from the few remaining guests. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the months of feeling invisible, the painful conversations with my family, the decision to prioritize my own happiness over other people's expectations. Do you think we'll do things differently when we have kids? I asked, thinking about family patterns and the cycles that repeat themselves across generations. Differently how? I want to make sure all our children feel seen and celebrated for who they are, not just for how easy they are to manage.
Theo
kissed my temple. Then that's what we'll do. We'll pay attention to who they actually are instead of who we think they should be. As we started to clean up from the reception, working alongside our remaining friends and family to fold chairs and collect centerpieces, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with perfect execution and everything to do with authentic celebration. This was what I'd been searching for all along. The feeling of being genuinely known and loved by the people who mattered most. It had taken me 26 years and a completely reimagined wedding to find it, but I'd finally learned the difference between being seen and being useful, between being loved and being convenient. Later that night, as Theo and I drove away from the celebration toward our honeymoon cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I thought about the girl who'd gotten engaged 11 months earlier. So excited to start planning her dream wedding. She'd gotten her dream wedding. In the end, it had just turned out to be completely different from what she'd originally imagined. Sometimes, the most beautiful transformations happen when we stop trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for us and start creating our own. 6 months after our wedding, I was sitting at my kitchen table writing thank you notes to the guests who had celebrated with us in Nadine's garden. It was a ritual I'd stretched out over several weeks, wanting to savor the process of acknowledging each person who had witnessed our marriage and contributed to the joy of that day. The thank you notes had become something more than social obligation. They were love letters to the community we built around ourselves. The people who had chosen to show up for our authentic celebration rather than the performance we might have staged for a larger audience. Thank you for traveling from Seattle to dance under the fairy lights, I wrote to Maya. Having you there made everything feel complete. Thank you for the flowers from your garden and for understanding that the most beautiful arrangements come from the heart, I wrote to Sam. To Aunt Nadine. Thank you for sharing your space, your wisdom, and your courage. You taught me, but it's never too late to choose yourself. The relationship with my immediate family had evolved into something more honest if less warm than I'd once hoped for. My mother and I spoke regularly now, but our conversations had a different quality, more careful, more boundaried, less assuming of unconditional accommodation from me. She never apologized for the way she'd handled my wedding planning, but she'd also stopped expecting me to prioritize everyone else's needs above my own. Delaney and I had grown closer. Surprisingly, watching me claim my own space had somehow given her permission to examine her own patterns, and she'd started therapy to work through what she called golden child syndrome, the pressure of always being the center of attention and the exhaustion of constantly performing excitement and gratitude. I realized I don't actually know who I am when I'm not being celebrated. She'd told me over coffee a few months after both our weddings, and that's almost as isolating as feeling invisible. We'd started having regular sister dinners, just the two of us, learning to relate to each other as adults rather than as competing children vying for the same limited resources of parental attention. The biggest change had been with my father. Our relationship had deepened into something I'd never expected: genuine friendship based on mutual respect rather than obligation. He'd started calling me every Sunday and would talk for an hour about work, books, politics, life observations. That had nothing to do with family management or problem solving. "I'm proud of who you've become," he'd said during one of these calls. "But more than that, I like who you've become. You're interesting and thoughtful and brave in ways that have nothing to do with your achievements." It was the first time in my life I felt seen by a parent for who I was rather than what I could do. Theo and I had settled into married life with the same intentionality we'd brought to our wedding planning. We'd bought a small house with a garden where I could grow flowers and vegetables, and we'd filled it with furniture that reflected our actual taste rather than what we thought was expected. We hosted dinner parties for friends, traveled to places we'd always wanted to see, and built traditions that felt meaningful to us rather than obligatory. The most significant change, though, was internal. I'd learned to distinguish between being helpful and being used, between being independent and being isolated, between being loved and being convenient. The skills I developed in advocating for my wedding had transferred to other areas of my life, my work, my friendships, my daily choices about how to spend time and energy. I'd also started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped young women develop leadership skills and self-advocacy. Working with girls who were learning to use their voices reminded me daily of how important it was to model what it looked like to claim space and ask for what you deserve. One evening in March, almost exactly a year after the confrontation that had changed everything, I was cooking dinner when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer.
"Liora? This is Carmen from Petals and Pine. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from your Aunt Nadine."
Carmen was the florist I originally planned to use, the one whose services I canceled when I'd redesigned my entire wedding. I'd worried for months that I'd burned a bridge with someone whose work I genuinely admired. "I wanted to call and thank you," she continued, surprising me completely. "Thank me? Your aunt showed me pictures from your wedding, and the arrangements were absolutely beautiful. More importantly, she told me about your journey to create the celebration you actually wanted instead of what you thought you were supposed to want." Carmen's voice was warm and genuine. That conversation changed how I think about my work with brides. I've started asking different questions, really listening to what couples want instead of assuming they want what's traditional or expected. "That's wonderful," I said, feeling touched that my story had resonated beyond my own experience. "I wanted you to know that your courage to change course inspired me to be more intentional about helping couples create authentic celebrations. You probably helped more brides than you know just by choosing to honor your own vision."
After we hung up, I sat with that conversation for a long time. The idea that my struggle to claim my own wedding had somehow contributed to other women feeling empowered to do the same felt like the most meaningful outcome I could have imagined. That weekend, Theo and I drove out to visit Aunt Nadine. She'd been working on a series of paintings inspired by the garden wedding, and she wanted to show us the latest pieces. When we arrived, she led us to her studio, a converted barn behind her house that I'd never seen before. The paintings were magnificent. Impressionistic captures of moments from our wedding day rendered in soft, dreamy colors that made the whole celebration look like something from a fairy tale. There was one of me and Theo exchanging vows under the oak tree, another of guests gathered around the dinner tables under string lights, and a large canvas showing the garden at twilight with couples dancing on the makeshift dance floor. These are going to be part of a series called Authentic Celebrations, Nadine explained. I'm painting weddings and parties and gatherings where people chose meaning over performance. Your wedding was the inspiration for the whole project. They're beautiful, Theo said, studying the painting of our first dance. You captured something I didn't even know I was feeling in that moment. What's that? I asked. Complete contentment. Like everything in the world was exactly as it should be. Looking at the paintings, I remembered that feeling, the way the evening had unfolded with natural ease. How every detail had felt right, because it reflected who we actually were rather than who we thought we should be. As we were getting ready to leave, Nadine pulled me aside. I have something for you, she said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a silver locket, old-fashioned and elegant, with a photo of me and Theo from our wedding day inside. This was my grandmother's, she said. I've been saving it for someone in the family who understood that the most precious things are often the simplest ones. I felt tears spring to my eyes. Nadine, I can't take this. You already took the most important thing I had to offer, the lesson that it's never too late to choose yourself. The locket is just a symbol. Driving home that evening, I thought about the year that had passed since my engagement, about the woman I'd been then, and the woman I'd become. The journey from invisible daughter to empowered adult had been more difficult than I'd expected, but also more transformative. I'd learned that family love doesn't always look like what we think it should, but that doesn't mean we have to accept less than we deserve. I'd learned that claiming space for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And I'd learned that the most beautiful celebrations happen when we have the courage to honor what actually brings us joy instead of what we think is expected. That night, I finished the last of my thank you notes. The final one was to myself. Practice L had suggested months earlier as a way of acknowledging my own growth. Thank you for learning to use your voice, I wrote. Thank you for choosing authenticity over approval. Thank you for planning a wedding that reflected who you actually are instead of who you thought you should be. Thank you for discovering that being loved for exactly who you are is so much better than being appreciated for how convenient you are. I sealed the note in an envelope and put it in the box where I kept mementos from our wedding day. Someday, when I needed reminding of my own strength, I'd read it again and remember the year I learned to plan my own life instead of managing everyone else's expectations. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to where Theo was already asleep. I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building a life that actually fits the person you are. It had taken me 26 years to figure out what that looked like, but I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. The people who truly love you will celebrate your growth instead of resenting it, and the people who don't, well, those people teach you just as much about who you want to become. 6 months into our marriage, I realized something unexpected. Quiet can be louder than celebration. The fan hummed above us one Sunday morning as Theo read the news out loud. in snippets, pausing when I laughed. Our little home, just big enough for 2 people and a future, was still half furnished, with a dining chair doubling as my office stool and my grandmother's old trunk posing as a coffee table. But it was ours. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was evidence. A piece of arrival. I'd spent so long preparing for a single day that I hadn't considered what would follow. The to-do list had ended. The polite war with my mother over priorities had gone dormant. Even Delaney, who had once unintentionally eclipsed my joy, had settled into her new life. For the first time, there were no looming emotional negotiations to manage. No vendor calls, no crisis to solve. Just us. And Theo. A mismatched couple with aligned values and complementary neuroses. I thought stillness would feel boring. It didn't. It felt like the exhale I'd been holding in since childhood. Still. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if my mother thought of the wedding. If she remembered the music, the toasts, the silverware clinking under fairy lights in Nadine's garden, or if, in her mind, it was just a concession she'd made. A compromise. I never asked if our calls had become brief and cordial. She asked about work and I asked about her travels. We rarely ventured past the surface. It wasn't cruel. It just wasn't warm. What I did ask eventually was this: did you ever feel like you disappeared when your own mother was in the room? She was silent for a while. Then, very quietly, she said, "Yes, all the time." It didn't fix anything, but it explained a lot. There was a time I believed closure came from confrontation. That if I said the perfect words, articulate, unflinching, raw, I could finally force people to see what they've refused to. But healing, I've found, doesn't always need witnesses. Sometimes it just needs honesty, even if the only person reading it is you. So I started writing letters, not emails, not texts, actual ink on paper letters, to people who had mattered, and people who still did. One to my father, thanking him for showing up not just at the altar, but in the emotional aftermath of my decision. "You saw me," I wrote. "Maybe too late for the little girl who needed you, but right on time for the woman I became." One to Delaney, who was working through her own unraveling of golden child expectations. "You were never my enemy, only my mirror." One to Elle, who had reminded me again and again that loving yourself is not arrogance, it's basic hygiene. And one to myself. That one was hardest, because I had to admit I'd stayed quiet too long. I made myself convenient. I participated in my own invisibility. But I also had to acknowledge something else. I'd stopped. I'd stopped waiting to be chosen and chose myself instead. The letter ended with a promise. From now on, I will never again hand someone else the pen when my story is still being written. I sealed it, dated it, and tucked it in the back of the wedding album. Not for nostalgia, but for safekeeping. For the next time I needed reminding, our backyard didn't start as much. Just overgrown. Grass and a tired fence with ivy claiming the corners. But like everything else in this season of reclamation, it became something beautiful through attention, effort, and time. I planted lavender first, then creeping thyme, marigolds, and mint. I bought a secondhand bench, sanded it down, and painted it the same color as the dusk sky on our wedding night. Theo joked that I was turning into Nadine. I took it as the compliment it was. That garden became my therapy, my declaration. Each seed a whisper of something I once thought I'd never have space for. Became a gathering place, too. Sunday brunches with Elle and Sam, fire pit nights with Maya and her husband, occasional dinners where Delaney and I sat side by side without pretending anymore. She'd started seeing a therapist. Said she wanted to understand who she was without.
Applause. I used to think you were the lucky one. She confessed over rosemary potatoes one evening. Because you were strong and calm. But now I realize ... you just had to be. And that's not the same thing as peace. We didn't hug, just held each other's gaze for a moment too long. It was enough. I invited my mother once, cautiously. She declined, said she was traveling. But later, she sent me a photo of a rosebush she planted just because it wasn't a confession. But maybe it was a beginning. A year had passed. And on the anniversary of our wedding, Theo handed me a notebook with a soft leather cover and a card tucked inside. The card said, "For your next story." The notebook was blank, but I'd begun writing essays about women and silence, weddings and war, joy and choosing yourself. A few had been published. One had gone modestly viral, sparking a thread of comments from other women who'd planned weddings in the shadows of louder sisters, mothers, cultures. Their words felt like echoes. And also like kinship. One woman wrote, "Your wedding gave me permission to say no." Another said, "I canceled mine and started a garden instead." I thought back to my own wedding day, how I'd stood in front of 38 people and chosen joy over performance. How the woman I was then had been terrified but clear. I didn't know I was allowed. I whispered to Theo one night, tracing the spine of the notebook. Allowed to what? He asked, resting his hand over mine. To want something more honest. To take up space without apology. To be the bride and not the bridesmaid in my own life. He didn't answer. Just kissed me as if to say, "You never needed permission." Just practiced out. We toasted that night in the garden, surrounded by balloons I'd grown and people I'd chosen. It wasn't grand. It wasn't curated. It wasn't shared online, but it was real, and it was enough. A few months after our anniversary, I was asked to speak at a creative women's panel hosted by a local arts nonprofit. I nearly said no. Public speaking wasn't my thing. I could write my feelings with surgical clarity, but say them aloud? That felt like exposure without armor. Still, Theo encouraged me. Elle bribed me with cupcakes. I caved out the topic was invisible work, emotional labor, creative burnout. The invisible scaffolding women hold up while pretending it's all effortless. I walked onto that stage with shaking hands. But when I opened my notes and looked into the eyes of the women they're artists, caretakers, freelancers, mothers, daughters, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I was just telling the truth. I used to wait to be chosen, I said, for approval, for space, for permission. And somewhere along the way, I learned that the only one I really needed to choose me was... There was a pause in the room, a silence I didn't fear. Afterward, a woman approached me, probably in her 50s. She didn't say much, just, "I wish someone had said that to me 20 years ago." It hit me harder than applause. That moment became the seed for something bigger, a newsletter, a design project focused on rituals of self-celebration, workshops for women redefining their voice. My inbox filled faster than I expected. Turns out, there are more of us than I ever imagined, quiet daughters, loud hearts, learning to be the main character. Being chosen by others is nice, but choosing yourself? That's holy. One rainy afternoon, I got a call from my mother. Not a text. Not a forwarded article with a thought of you note. A real call. She sounded tired, not physically, but emotionally. Like someone who'd been holding their breath too long. I wanted to ask something. She said, I braced myself. Okay, would it be all right if I came to visit? No expectations. Just, I'd like to see your home. Not the pictures. The real thing, I said yes. I didn't say finally
Or why now? Just yes, out she arrived the next Saturday. Brought wine and a pie that, by her own admission, had burned slightly. Around the edges, she walked through her house slowly, touching surfaces as if they were fragile. It's beautiful, she said. Not magazine beautiful, real beautiful, like it breathes. I poured us tea. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the one Theo and I had built ourselves from reclaimed wood and good intentions. I didn't know how to be a mother who saw you, she said. I was so afraid of failing at the big things. I missed the small ones, the ones that matter. This time I did cry, but not because it hurt, because it healed. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it like a trophy. We just sat there, drinking tea, as two women trying to unlearn their mothers and remember themselves. When she left, she hugged me longer than she ever had. Not tightly, just fully, as if she saw me, and maybe finally she did. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.